Welcome to the Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgaway. Good evening and welcome to the Doctor's Corner on the Call 360 Network with your host, Dr. Kline. Joining Dr. Kline tonight is special guest, Dr. Josh Bloom. There are two ways to listen into tonight's program: through our website, www.callnation.com, or our YouTube channel, The Doctor's Corner. Make sure to please subscribe to our YouTube channel to get reminders of when we are on live. Now, Dr. Kline loves to hear from you and answer all of your questions from our mailbag. If you have future mailbag questions, please email them to janelle.elgaway. That's JONELLE.ELGAWAY at call360.com. Now, if you have questions, please feel free to call in at 415-915-2291. And now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kline and Dr. Josh Bloom to the Doctor's Corner. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening. I didn't know Bloom was going to be on.
Well, he said gentleman, so that must have confused you.
Yes. We've asked Dr. Bloom to be on the program because Josh is a real scientist. He has a PhD in organic chemistry, a course I nearly failed at the University of Maryland. Unfortunately, it was required to get into medical school, so I had to pay the instructor. But we won't go into that at this time. Josh knows a lot more about organic chemistry than I do, but he also knows a lot more about science. The problem with doctors is that we're busy. We pick up a journal, and we quickly read the title, and then we quickly read the abstract, and then we form opinions. And that's really not a good idea. First, we do have a question from our mailbag. A woman with two teenagers, a girl and a boy, is petrified that they're going to go to a party, become addicted, and die. Now, that's a reasonable fear for a parent to have, especially when you see articles about some poor kid that's, had an athletic injury, was given Vicodin, and now he's dead. I mean, this is serious stuff. But we have to be real careful that we're getting all the facts. First of all, these are very rare. These news stories appear and nobody forgets them. Representatives from Congress go to the funerals. This is opium products causing death. But in fact, this is very rare. It's very rare to have the genes present so that you can become addicted. So doctors do fail by not asking people if they've ever had an opiate. Parents need to know their kids have never had an opiate. They go in there and they say to the doctor, okay, I've never had an opiate. Then what happens? You don't get opiates? No. You ask then, do you have a family history of addiction? If you don't, the next question is, okay, how about alcohol? Have you had any problems with alcohol? No. So here's the story. You have a 4 in 1,000 chance, or less than 1%, you might be carrying this gene. And if you are, you're going to go to the moon when you swallow your first tablet. And that's information coming from addicts. This starts with the first tablet. This is a triggered phenomenon. So if the teenager goes back and says, Mom, I just went to the moon, the mother says, guess what? You may have addiction. And so we're going to go right back to the doctor and we're going to figure out what to do. If doctors did that, we would have no more deaths from addiction. 0. Because it would all be managed by doctors. You're not going to be able to prevent it because you've got the genes. It's going to happen. So that was a little question we had in the mailbag. In terms of news, everybody heard that Scott Gottlieb is leaving as director of FDA. That's too bad. He's a moderate. The only other moderate is the Surgeon General, who's a very nice fellow and makes a lot of nice, positive statements. But when I looked into it, Surgeon Generals basically have no authority. They're just advisors, and nobody listens to them. But Scott Gottlieb's different, so we need to look forward to who's going to replace him. We need to keep up the drumbeat about, there's a difference between addiction and pain medicine. There are 10 times more people taking pain medicine for legitimate painful disease than there are hardcore heroin addicts. So one other little piece of news before we get to our article that Dr. Bloom and I are going to go over. There's this notion going around that people in pain are worse when the weather changes. Everybody's kind of passed it off. There's been a study to show, there's nothing to it. So we did a Twitter poll, and we've got 600 on there as of now. It's still running. 90% of people with chronic painful disease have distinct worsenings in their pain when the weather's bad. So lo and behold, I get my librarian to find articles on pressure, atmospheric pressure, and pressure in the brain. And she finds this obscure article written in Polish that fortunately was translated. They did some experiments on people with brain injuries and measured the effect of atmospheric pressure on the pressure inside your brain. And guess what? There's a distinct correlation. If the atmospheric pressure is below 29.30, it increases the intracranial pressure. And this can explain a lot of symptoms. And as we know now that fibromyalgia is really not fibromyalgia, it's really a central brain inflammation, that if your brain's inflamed and now your brain is swelling a little bit, you're going to be sending out more pain signals. Because fibromyalgia and other inflammatory diseases are throughout your body. So you got inflammation in your brain. How come it's out in the rest of your body? That's because your brain's in charge. Your brain can actually create pain by demodulating it, pain that would normally not be noticed, and now you make it noticeable. So now the other pressure is at 30.3, you're okay. So below 29.3, increased pressure, above 30.3, you're fine. So what we're doing on Twitter, and if anybody's listening tonight, if you've noticed that you get worse when the pressure is changing or it's rainy out, look at the barometer or go to your weather channel. It will tell you what the barometric pressure is and write it down. And then you can email it to me or you can put it on Twitter direct messaging. And my email address is thomasklinemd@gmail.com. Simple. I think we're on to something there. I really do. I was shocked that 90% of people reporting problems with low pressure, bad weather, 6% said they had problems with nice weather, and 6 or 8% said they had no problems. I mean, that's really striking. Now, a lot of people like to criticize Twitter polls, and they're not super scientific. But on the other hand, these are like probes or preliminary pieces of information. It's like a sidewalk interview. So in other words, in New York City, you could stop people on the street and say, do you have problems with these smelly exhaust fumes? And if you interview 25 people and 20 of them say yes, then that's impetus to do more studies. What the government needs to do is an emergency study right away, putting ads in newspapers and say, do you have chronic pain? Then contact us and let us know, does it work? Let us know if you've been cut back. Let us know if you're suicidal, because until they do that, nobody's going to believe it. But based on our estimates, it looks like there's 5 or 6 million people And then everybody's going, well, these Twitter polls are useless. Next case? Hey, the obvious is not always an illusion. So, we have a report that came out from Roswell Park, a very famous cancer hospital up in Buffalo, New York, and they said opioid prescriptions can be drastically reduced after surgery with no increase in pain. Striking. Roswell Park's research leads to new care guidelines to combat the opioid crisis. So Josh and I have both read this, and since Josh is the scientist, we'll let him go first and give us his impressions, because this appears to be an important paper. You think it was, Josh?
Define important.
Well, as a doctor, if there's an important paper, that means I am going to change my practice.
Okay, well then, I would say it's important, but you're going to change it in the wrong direction because of this.
Okay.
I've had only 45 minutes to go through it, and I was playing Pac-Man with one hand, so I didn't have full concentration on this. But the problems I'm going to describe with this study are typical of epidemiology. And I'm going to start with your poll as an example of some of the problems with epidemiology. Your Twitter poll is guilty of two things. It's guilty of selection bias and reporting bias, and those are both errors. The people who would be watching and listening are people in pain, so there's your selection bias. It's not general population. And the people who are reporting pain during bad weather are more likely to report it than people who don't have pain during bad weather. So that's reporting bias. That's why a study like that means just about nothing, as does the Roswell study for some of the same reasons. I hope I haven't hurt your feelings.
Do you expect to be invited back? Oh, no, Josh,
yeah,
that's perfectly okay.
But
okay.
I wasn't doing that.
These are good points. Yes,
right.
Yes.
So I mean, at ACSH, one of the things we do is pick apart bad studies, and you could have, I could go for 10,000 years and never run out of them, and they generally all use the same tricks and they have the same limitations. And the Roswell one, although I haven't had time to really dive into the deepest parts of it and to find more of the errors, there's some general ones that I can speak to. And all I can say is the more I read this paper, the worse it gets. So, what's wrong with it? Well, first of all, it's a retrospective study. In other words, a good study is a prospective study where you start with two groups, one getting placebo, one getting medicine X, and you've got an outcome to measure, whether that's pain or infection or whatever, and you've got double-blinded scientists doing the work. So that's a good study. That's what they do to get drugs approved. A retrospective study is also called data dredging. So what you do is you use powerful computers to look up data from all kinds of different sources, and then you assemble a couple of different groups, a group with this and a group with something else, and you compare the two with some number of variables. So right away, it should be obvious that the criteria for selection is very often going to determine the answer at the end. And people play tricks all the time, like they will say women 40 to 55, but they'll leave out women 55 to 60 because that didn't match. They got a different answer, and they only reported one. So that's the kind of thing you see in retrospective studies, and they're mostly garbage. This one I wouldn't call garbage, but it's got some problems. The first one is that they have two primary outcomes, and they have two groups. The first group was a 2016 group where they used plain old whatever post-operative, so that would be a mixture of opioids and Advil and whatever they were using. And that the drugs that were used in that group are unknown. And they had another group, which is this, what do they call it, ultra-restricted opioid prescription protocol management. And they call that OPOP or OPLOP or something like that. So the group compared the 2016 people who were just getting normal whatever drugs after surgery to the restricted group in 2017 where they were getting essentially no opioids. It was just Advil and Tylenol. Okay, so you have two different groups in 2 different years, and the primary outcomes are both bad news. The first was pain after 14 days. Well, why not pain after 14 years? These were urological surgeries. They're relatively minor procedures. So you would expect any group, no matter what they were given in the hospital or after, to have no significant problems after 14 days. So right away there's a problem. And the second outcome would be the number of 30-day refill requests. And that would be comparing patients with restricted opioids or no opioids versus whatever came before that. Well, obviously, if you're not prescribed opioids when you leave the hospital, you're going to be much less likely to have them in 30 days. And 30 days, again, it's a long time after a relatively minor procedure. So those are, the two main problems, but it gets worse than that. For example, it's also self-reported pain data. So self-reporting is a notoriously inaccurate way to gather data. So you're asking patients to recall something from, some time in the past, and pain reporting is it's not really quantitative anyhow. So you see, what's growing here is different branches of a bad study. So the primary outcomes were both not satisfactory to measure pain right after an operation, which is what this is. They're claiming that you can use no opioids and people will be fine after an operation, but they're looking 14 days later. And even worse, the data from 14 days later is not statistically significant, so it shouldn't even be in the paper.
So would you give this a thumbs up or a thumbs down rating? Remember Siskel and Ebert?
Many thumbs down. And let me just go into one other thing. They have a whole lot of really nice-looking graphs, and as I'm leafing through them, here's what they prove. One proves that in groups that were restricted from getting opioids, got fewer opioids than groups that were not restricted from getting opioids. I mean, it's crazy sounding, but they have these graphs showing that people who weren't prescribed opioids got fewer prescriptions for opioids, like duh. And there was another one where they were looking at the number of refills. Again, people who did and did not get opioids. Well, this is kind of obvious. That so yeah, I don't want to go into epidemiology because I'll make a fool out of myself. But those are just some of the major errors in this study. And if I had some more time, I could come up with some more. So I would have to say this is probably meaningless or damn close to it.
Okay. As a physician, I had to ask myself, why are they doing this? What's behind this? And what's behind it is a statement made by the chief investigator, who said, opioid addiction can be viewed as a significant postoperative complication in that clinical teams must work to prevent. Now, I have another study right here. Ta-da. This was done at Loyola, another surgical study. It was done in 2017, and same kind of thing. They had postoperative urological cases, but, pretty similar to abdominal surgery. And they treated 1,100 postoperative patients, outpatients, with opiates. They did not restrict the opiates. And of the 1,100 patients, guess how many addicted? Guesses from the audience? Anybody? Josh?
6.
1. Close enough.
Dr. Kline?
Pretty close.
Yes?
Dr. Kline, we
Yes.
have a call, I believe you've been expecting.
Okay. We're going to listen to the next caller. Go ahead, caller.
Yes, hey, Dr. Kline.
Hello. We have been talking about issues at pharmacies. Pharmacies cutting people off, refusing to fill prescriptions, and telling me on Twitter that he had an interesting experience with a pharmacy. And why don't you just go ahead and tell us what happened?
I had, after back surgery, my medications kind of changed a little bit and started to increase just a little bit. And my pharmacy is a hometown pharmacy. It's Wayne Pharmacy, who I've been going to for 10 or 15 years. They know me by name when I walk in. I mean, I never had any issues there. But during the whole opioid scare, you could tell the pharmacist lady, she started cringing when I walked in, so forth. And it finally got to the point where she pulled me to the side and said that she could not she did not feel comfortable filling this request that my primary care doctor had written for my pain medicine. And she said that she asked if I went to a pain clinic. I said no. I said I go to my primary care doctor. He's been writing the medicine for me. She said, well, since you don't go to a pain clinic and since you don't have urine tests, I do not feel comfortable writing this or filling this medicine for you.
Well, that's interesting. So you were getting the prescriptions?
Yes, and the
okay. So these were just
these were just refills. And the funny thing is, they had written for the higher dose the previous year.
Okay, so you were actually on more the previous year. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's all she said? Did she call the doctor?
She had been in contact with the doctor every month.
Okay.
They had been.
But did she call and say she was discontinuing the doctor's program?
No, this time she did not.
Okay. Well,
and when I tried to talk to her about it, she was very snappy and just very dismissive, and she wouldn't let me talk or anything. So it was her way or highway.
Okay. We found another person on Twitter who had a similar experience. So why don't we hear from him next, and then we can discuss both issues, and possibly a third person. I'm not sure. But anyway, let's go to the second caller and hear what he had to say.
Okay, he has not called in yet, so we're still waiting with him.
All right.
We have about 3 calls in the queue if you'd like to take some.
Well, I want to finish this issue first.
Okay.
Because this is very interesting. In Texas, the Board of Registration in Medicine feels that if a pharmacist ends a treatment, that pharmacist needs to have a medical license. And if you don't have a medical license and you're attempting to treat somebody or untreat them, see, stopping medicine is considered treatment, then you are in violation of the state law not having a license to practice medicine, which is a felony. So when you go into a pharmacist for the first time and they say, I don't feel comfortable, that's an issue, but it's not a violation of the law. I, as a registered physician, licensed physician, have the right to prescribe medicines, and it is only my prerogative to stop them. In other words, all treatments have a stop and a start, and that's up to me to decide, not a pharmacist. So I would like to hear from people if they've been in this circumstance of having an existing prescription suddenly cut off, especially without contacting the doctor. So thank you, David. That's an interesting piece of information.
Yeah.
And according to the text... Go ahead.
Oh, they had been filling the or an opioid medicine for me for at least 8 or 9 years. So
wow.
It's not like it was something new.
So nothing different happened. So this sounds like another case of CDC fallout, we're calling it, the opioid paranoia, that a pharmacist got so nervous she would do something that's not only unethical, but apparently, we're looking into it, illegal practice of medicine. I mean, that's not why pharmacists were put behind the counter and why they receive 4 years training like I do. That's not what they're supposed to do. So thank you for calling in. And if anybody else has any pharmacy stories, call in. And meanwhile, we can take the callers you have in line there, Chief Engineer.
Okay, very good. We'll go ahead and give you the next one here. Okay, and caller from 716. What's
Hi.
your name and what's your question for Dr. Kline?
My name is Jessica. Leonard Massey, and I didn't really have a question. I just wanted to let him know when they were talking about the Roswell study and their ultra-restrictive opioid protocols. That was why we in the New York Don't Punish Pain rally group decided to do our rally at Roswell on the 29th of January. Yeah. It was about 7 degrees, and we only had 3 people show up, but we were out there. But while we were there, they invited us into the hospital, and we met with a Dr. Oscar De Leon Casasola, who apparently, he told us, was the co-author of that study. And we also met, he is the Chief Division of Pain Medicine, and we met with Dr. Amy Case, who works in the Palliative and Supportive Care Division, who trained under Dr. Portnoy.
Yeah,
and it was
Portnoy.
A very...
Yep.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I was pronouncing that correctly.
Oh, you got it right.
We had a very good discussion about this, because the whole reason that I became involved in that was just the name of the protocol, that ultra restrictive, and I'm not a professional by any means, but I did read the study, and I just wanted to bring up another point that some people don't seem to consider, is that people that are going into surgeries for the first time, and, it may be their first time dealing with this kind of thing, they're not yet chronic, they hear all of this horrible information on the news about how deadly the opioids are, and of course they're not going to ask for more pain medicine if they need it, they're going to be afraid. You've probably heard story after story as well of people that say, for years I refused to take the opiate prescriptions, the pain medicines that my doctor wanted me to take. But then I finally gave in, and my whole life changed. You know.
Yeah, very common story. The fear. What did the salaried physicians say to you? Were they culpable at all? They just thought, oh, this is a great idea. Oh, we're going to save addictions. What was their take?
They didn't say anything about the addiction. They didn't allow us to record the conversation, but I took notes. And Dr. De Leon said that he didn't really like the name of it either, the ultra restrictive opioid protocol. He didn't care for that. But I was surprised how open they were. Apparently, Dr. De Leon has stuck up for, he said, 2 other doctors that have been harassed by the DEA and were having trouble, and that they were very open to their patients getting pain relief, because that was one of my problems is, you know, on the surface, when not reading the study itself, but just reading their little, you know, post-report of it or pre-report of it before you get to the study, you know, it doesn't sound like such a bad idea that they're, you know, first-time people, they're just cutting back some of the pain meds that they're going to get, but they can still get them. And if they need more, we'll give them to them. But we all know how that works out, you know. They say this stuff, but what these people say and what actually happens and what's reality is a completely different thing.
Yeah, they kind of told everybody, you know, look, you're going to get a 3-day supply, and this is plenty. And, you know, everybody seems to do okay with this. And then, you know, what are you going to do? So you're in pain, you're at home, you're thinking, they're not going to give me any more of this. And, you know, I'm just going to buck up. The other thing in medicine is you learn real quick after you've practiced 6 months. No 2 patients are alike. No 2 patients have the same response to medicines. So they give everybody a 3-day supply. And then they used this. They said they saved 16,300 opioid tablets, 5 milligram oxycodone equivalent. 5 milligrams oxycodone is a dose you'd give a cat. So I don't know what they're talking about. But if you take the 16,000 opioid tablets and you divide it by 30 milligrams, which is the usual dose, you get over a year, they saved 548 tablets. But I've got a lot of patients who take 250 tablets a month, you know, for their terrible, painful disease. So this is what, I mean, Josh already said, you know, this really doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But what I call these kinds of studies are agenda studies. These are studies to prop up an agenda. 2 places it says in here, this is to prevent opioid use, abuse, and diversion. There's no proof that this happened. They didn't do any, no one got addicted, and they must feel that if you only give somebody 3 days worth, they're not going to become addicted. So you give everybody in the hospital, you know, this is like practicing medicine back in the 1800s. You know, here's a bottle, 15 pills, and this is what everybody gets. The hardest thing it is for me as a practitioner, and I think a lot of doctors, somebody comes in and they've got this rare, painful disease. You know, they got this horrible disease. It's ruined their life, and you take a little history and you find out it's really ruined their life, and they can't work, or they quit working, and they can't take care of their children, and blah, blah, blah. And they say, I'm really in a lot of pain, doctor. And I'm supposed to figure out how much pain they're in order to set the dosage? How do you do that? I don't have an answer to that, but these people do. You just give them 3 days worth. So Josh is a thumbs down on this, and so am I. I think it's a completely useless study, and it's misleading. It's an agenda study. It gives everybody the impression that they're controlling addiction, and they aren't, because the other study showed 1 person per 1,000 addicted, and that's my exact number. Okay? That's based on the government says there's 1 million addicts. Divide that by the population. You get 4 per 1,000, 90% addict in teenage years, and that leaves you with 1 per 1,000. And lo and behold, here's this supportive study that says 1 in 1,100. Actually, I almost fell over when I read this because my little calculation, I thought, this can't be right. 1 per 1,000. So right now in this country, there's 1 per 1,000 people running around with the genes to opioid addiction, proved by this study done at Loyola. But yet these people are going to punish 999 people by putting them on less pain medicine than they need, and they don't know how much they need anyway, since nobody knows. The FDA, who's in charge of all this, recommends, and good doctors recommend, you titrate the drug. Just like you titrate insulin, you titrate Coumadin, you just slowly keep increasing it until it works or you get a side effect. Real simple. When I was in medical school, we were taught about pain, in spite of what everybody says. And really, the instructor said, okay, you just kind of pick a low dose and you give it to them. 30 minutes later, if it's not working, you double it. 30 minutes later, if it's not working, you keep doubling it. I have patients taking 10 milligrams of oxycodone every 4 hours, and I have some taking 150 milligrams every 4 hours. Both getting the same pain relief, neither one addicted, neither one dead from overdose, and neither one with all the side effects you hear. So,
Dr. Kline, I'm sorry. I believe our second caller that you're looking for is actually available.
Right. So I will stop ranting, and apparently Dr. Bloom has dozed off, so we'll come back to him.
Sorry.
Yes, okay. Well, you try to be calm, and we'll come back, and we'll discuss selection bias. Good evening.
Good evening.
We hear you, like the last caller, had a little problem that we learned about through Twitter with your pharmacy. Now, why don't you tell us about what happened?
I approached the pharmacy and explained that I was going to need a pharmacy to fill a prescription that I was getting for 30 milligram oxycodone. And he initially was very receptive to my needs. I explained my situation, that, I was a veteran that had been forcibly tapered by the VA and had found a doctor that was willing to take care of my prescription, and I just needed to find a pharmacy that was outside, of course, the chains, because we all know about them. And he was very helpful, gave me his private cell phone number and everything, and said, anything you need, call me. And I was like, oh, well, great. That lasted about a month, and then just out of the blue, it went from him being extremely willing to help to the cold shoulder. And I couldn't really get an answer why that was. It was just all of a sudden, I'm not going to be able to fill your prescriptions anymore. Bye. and that was that.
So did you ever find out what was behind this?
No, I never did. And they weren't willing to provide any answers. They just got really standoffish. And, I went from having the pharmacist ear, like I said, the initial warm reception that I had went away. And then it was like I'd become kryptonite and just avoid me at all costs.
Well, did it have anything to do with the new prescription drug monitoring computer program by any chance? That's been a problem for a lot of pharmacies, red flagging people and then becoming frightened. Anything like that occur?
Oh, that actually, yes, now that you mention it, that reminds me, there was that. He said something about how there was a flag in this is in Georgia, and there was a flag in the system, but it was very cryptic. It was just there were no specifics. It was just a mention about some kind of a flag in Georgia's PDMP. But
did he give you a bridging prescription where to get you through while you found another pharmacist or something? Just like a week's supply?
No, okay. Nothing. And in fact, that got mentioned by the doctor. Can you at least give him a bridging prescription to get it by until we get all this figured out? And even that was a very firm no.
So, in other words, the physician did talk to the pharmacist and ask for this bridging prescription, but the pharmacist just said, too bad. And so if that's an existing prescription, it's like the last caller, that's the pharmacist practicing medicine. A pharmacist cannot stop a medication that has been prescribed by a physician. I mean, that's like if you go to a radiation center for your cancer, and the secretary there says, I'm sorry, no more cancer treatment. The only person that can end the cancer treatment is the person who started the cancer treatment. So maybe these Texas folks are right. Maybe cease and desist or even warrants should be handed out by the Board of Medicine, not the Board of Pharmacy, the Board of Medicine, and say, you're practicing medicine, Jack, and you better be careful because you may harm this patient. And that's why only licensed people start and stop prescription.
Yeah, and that's very true. And there are three words. And I used to work as a surgical tech, and there were three words that were very important in my line of work, and those three words were scope of practice. And in my line of work as a surgical tech, even though I'm there working side by side with a surgeon, I had to know my lane and stay in my lane. I wasn't allowed to just pick up a scalpel and, start cutting, doing anything.
Doing a heart transplant.
So, even though I was doing this work, and I may know exactly what to do and what the consequences of all that were going to be, but I had a scope of practice that I had to remain inside of, and it's the same thing with pharmacists, to where yes, they may think they know the answer, but
not scope of practice. Very good.
They're outside of the scope of practice.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's kind of true for all professions. Josh, have you run across that? What are your thoughts on this? Josh, you okay?
I'm here. Yeah, it's doctors thinking they know anything about chemistry and drugs is, especially surgeons. I've just found that whenever I see most doctors, or especially a surgeon, I end up giving them a lesson about drugs, which is vaguely disturbing. So that is in some way a scope of practice, but more of an intellectual way. But yeah, I totally get it.
Here in North Carolina, we are going to talk to some legislators about this. I don't feel comfortable. Since when does I don't feel comfortable become a practice watchword? I mean, if a lawyer takes on a case and finds out that their client is guilty, they don't just say, "Oh, sorry, I feel uncomfortable with this case." No, they are duty bound to continue. We're hearing a lot of this. So we are trying to figure out ways to approach the legislators, and your scope of practice is really a good idea, because you can say that a pharmacist has the right to do this and that, but does not have the right to cut off prescriptions, reduce the dose, whatever. And if they do feel uncomfortable when you come in there with a prescription, there needs to be some kind of ethical guideline. We were thinking maybe a little form they have to fill out giving the reason and show that they talk to the physician. What's happening is they're doing all these things without talking to the doctors. And, you know, what it's doing is it's splitting doctors and pharmacists further and further apart, which is really sad because druggists are an important part. We write a prescription and they fill it and they help give us advice and give the patients advice and blah, 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 you know. I mean, this is all fallout. 3 years now of the CDC guidelines, because the CDC guidelines portray opiates as drugs that do not work and are too dangerous to use, which neither of those statements is true. And they didn't have the prerogative to be making those statements. The most dangerous thing is that they said opiates should be used as a last resort. No, not when you're in pain. You use stuff that works. You don't go for Tai Chi, you know, when you broke your leg, or take a bunch of Tylenol. So the pharmacists, you see, are feeding into this fallout, and it's becoming a disaster. I am spending so much time on the phone with pharmacists and blah, 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 and trying to get people's prescriptions filled. You know, it's becoming real serious. So, having said that, do we... Go ahead.
You know, this is not too different from what you have in science. It's very trendy. Some big shot will start publishing some finding or a correction of a mechanism of a chemical reaction or whatever it is, and next thing you know, everybody's working on it. And they're all saying the same things. So I think there's a herd mentality in general. There certainly is in science and medicine, but in this case, it's, of course, being reinforced by the DEA and legislators, which makes it especially dangerous, which is what I wrote about recently, an article that appeared on Fox about government
I read
writing
that.
prescriptions.
Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Well, Henry Miller and I, Henry was the former deputy director of the FDA. We write a lot together. And we decided that what's going on in this country, never in the history, our history has government had a prescription pad in front of it. But now there are laws about what can be prescribed and how much. And I don't understand how we let this happen. Where's the ACLU? The DEA, being in the doctor's office with the doctor and the patient, it's an incredible violation of our rights. And the ACLU is worried about who's peeing in what bathroom. So somehow we ceded our right to a private relationship with our doctors without a whimper. How'd this happen?
You're correct.
I have no answer.
I tweeted that the reason I became interested in this issue 3 years ago with the CDC, quote, guidelines was I was concerned the CDC was going to come into my examination room and sit there next to me and tell me how to prescribe. The test should be, legal people like tests. So the test should be, does the government activity interfere with the doctor-patient relationship? And if it does, then that should be determined only by peers, which are other doctors. This was established in 1215 with the famous Magna Carta. The Magna Carta said you can round up the noble people and you can put them on trial, but they have to be tried by their peers. So if somebody is making laws about building bridges, you need to have engineers there. The doctors have been completely cut out of this because of the fear of opioid addiction. And just along those lines of fear of opioid addiction, This is a little graph. Let's see here. How does this thing work? This is a graph of opioid deaths since 1970. 1970. The only thing the CDC shows you are graphs from 1999. And why is that? That's when the CDC started collecting data. That's the CDC's data. This is data from other government agencies. There you go. 1970. So guess what I did? I got out my little calculator, and there's this famous statistic that gets repeated. Like you said, Josh, once you jump on this, you just keep repeating it. Nobody checks it. That the number of overdose deaths has quadrupled since 1999. And that's enough to scare the pants off anybody. But it's an agenda statistic. It's designed to terrorize people. So what I did is I took this little graph and I calculated how many overdose deaths there were prior to 1999 during the same 15-year period. Okay, guess what? The number of deaths quadrupled. So there you go. That's an example of dishonest science, of not looking at the graphs from the other agencies, of making up isolated statistics or agenda statistics. I have a good agenda statistic for you. Last year, more people died in Kansas than ever before. So don't go live in Kansas. I mean, the next question is, why did they die? Oh, well, they had a rattlesnake infestation. Okay, well, that makes sense. So how come more people are dying at the CDC Statistic Bureau? They've been dying more every year since 1970. Right? And who's dying? Anybody ever ask the CDC? Who is it that's dying?
Dr. Kline, would you like to take we have about 5 callers on hold right now. Would you like to take some?
Yeah, let's just bring them on. Josh
right.
and I are just waiting to make comments.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Caller from area code 303. What's your first name and what's your question for Dr. Kline and Josh?
Hi, Josh and Dr. Kline. This is Lovett or Peppermint Patty from Twitter. I called to tell you about a victory I earned through information I learned from you, but I did want to tell you that just last Friday, a pharmacist did this to me. And when I got my medicine, I went, wait a minute, this is not 80 pills. Well, I'm not comfortable. I'm like, you do not have the authority to make that decision. Did you call my doctor? No, I'm not comfortable. And we went back and forth and around and around. So Monday, I filed a complaint, and I made sure that in the complaint, I made the lady type it in that if I didn't get a resolution to this, I would go to the pharmacy board, and if that didn't work, I'd go to the medical board. And so we're still fighting it. But I know I learned from you and Josh and all you guys, you don't have that authority, and that's not okay. So, but I wanted to tell you that. Thank you. Well, I learned a lot from you guys. I've learned so much. And with all the information I learned, my doctor has cut me twice. But then I had a plan. So I started a series of discussions with my doctor. And I took all the information I learned from you, and I fed it back to him piece by piece by piece by piece. And I won a victory. He started me out now on low-dose fentanyl patches, and he's going to titrate it up. So, you know what? I think information is the key. What I learned is that most of these docs work 12 hours a day. They don't know what's going on out here. But once I explain the difference, which he should know, but, they get busy, between addiction, dependence, here's the statistics, here's what's going on. I won this victory, and I want to encourage all chronic pain patients to just soak up this information. Don't be afraid to say it to your doctors. I mean, I was straightforward, but I was polite. He's been my doctor going on 19 years. He knows me. But it was a hard-won victory, but it's because of everything I learned on the show. And I want to thank you for that, and Josh, because, You guys are the bomb, man. You guys rock.
Well, thank you.
And I'll let you know how.
Go ahead. Yeah, let us know.
I'll let you know how it turns out with the pharmacy stuff.
And if you haven't already, please share this with people so that they can use the same techniques in trying to discuss with their doctors. I mean, I'm a physician, and we're all pig-headed. It's just part of the profession. Scientists like Josh, they're not pig-headed at all. They're very flexible and have a proper selection, and they don't use selection bias. So anyway, can we have the next caller?
Absolutely. And we have a caller from area code 317. What's your name, first name, and what's your question for Dr. Kline and Josh?
Hi, my name is Michelle, and I'm calling from the state of Indiana. And I have been having a very difficult time, and I had a couple of things to share. I did today actually have an issue with my pharmacist, who I have been getting my opiate prescriptions filled there about 15 years, and they've been, gone along seemingly fairly well. Well, my PCP got to the point where she refuses to raise my opiates. Now, I'm on 15 milligrams 4 times a day and have been for about 3 years. So as you can imagine, it is doing less and less every day. It's just not taking care of my pain. So she referred me to a rheumatologist, but he was known to give opiates. So I went to see him after waiting 2 months to get in. Went to see him Friday. He said that at the beginning of January, everything changed. He said, I would have been happy to have given you more, but he said, it is a law now. The DEA swept through Indianapolis, threatened a couple of my colleagues in their clinic. It's not a pain clinic, but it's like for rehab. And he said, it is now against the law to give you more than 90 MME a day. So I told him, I said, that's just CDC. That's not a law. He goes, well, it's a law now. And he said, I cannot give you more than 90 MME. And he said, I can refer you to an actual pain clinic. But he said, I don't know, now that the DEA has come into town, if they will give you more than 90. So he handed me a prescription, the same as what my PCP had given me, exactly 90 MME, no more, and told me I could fill it on March 6th. So, and I had one prescription left from my PCP for exactly the same thing. So it turns out I called the pharmacist today, and I asked him if he would fill either the prescription that my PCP had on file on the 6th, or if I could fill this other doctor's on the 6th. And he said, what do you mean another doctor? And I said, well, she referred me to a different doctor. And I have a prescription in my hand from him that says I can fill it on the 6th. And he said, well, wait a minute. He said, I'm not comfortable doing that. And I said, he said, you are going to have to, you can't get a prescription from 2 different doctors. And I said, I understand. I'm not trying to duplicate them, but I just want to see which one I can fill on the 6th. And he said, well, you're going to have to pick one or the other doctor. I won't fill a prescription from 2 different doctors. I said, well, I'm not trying to fill them in the same month. I'm going to get one in March, either the 6th or the 7th, either tomorrow or Thursday, or I'm going to get, whichever one I can fill first. And, he says, well, you're going to have to, I said, well, I haven't found a doctor yet that will give me more than 90 MME. So I said, I haven't settled on the doctor. I've been referred to another one. I said, so until I finally, these are just 1 month at a time. I'm not asking, And he said, no, he just said, I'm not comfortable doing it. So I've listened to your other callers. I mean, can he just refuse?
No, you're perfectly within your right. When this happens, the pharmacist is frightened because in this state, if a complaint is filed against the pharmacist in North Carolina, it's publicized before it's adjudicated, which means, if somebody files a phony complaint, it gets published, and then the pharmacist loses all the rights to his or her business. And I don't know if it's that same way there, but pharmacists are frightened, doctors are frightened, and here's a suggestion. You can say to the pharmacist, look, I realize this is a tricky situation. How about I call the board of pharmacy and ask them? Now, the pharmacists should do that themselves. In other words, they should say, whoa, this is kind of tricky here. Why don't I call the board of pharmacy and see what they have to say? Now, this thing about the DEA, if you can, I just gave my email out. It's Thomas Kline, MD, K-L-I-N-E, Thomas Kline, MD at Gmail. If you could find out more about this, the DEA does not set doses nor amounts, and they're very careful not to do that. So this sounds like some kind of hysterical response, like Josh says, everybody's just jumping on the bandwagon. But if you could find out more about that, we're going to be trying to talk to Congress about the opioid refugee crisis and make specific recommendations that are reasonable. And if the DEA is telling and scaring doctors by dosage limits, the AMA just came out and said, whoa, nobody should be prosecuted based on CDC limits. Nobody, made a very strong statement. So nobody should be prosecuted by a board for prescribing too much medicine based on the CDC 90 milligrams, which, by the way, was only for first prescriptions. It does not apply to a prescription that follows the first prescription. And since you got prescriptions for 15 years, this 90 milligram thing, but it's more than that. It's hysteria. How do you deal with hysteria? Well, you deal with it with the truth. People can also go to the board of registration, and you know what? You can call the DEA office, too. They're public employees. They have offices, and you call them up and say, I have a question. My doctor thinks that he's going to get raided because I have a chronic painful disease, and he has to prescribe what he thinks is going to work for me, which happens to be over 90 milligrams. Well, is this what you people are doing? Just ask them. Same thing with the Board of Registration in Medicine. Call them up and ask them. Say, my doctor doesn't want to treat me because he's afraid he's going to lose his license to practice medicine here. Here's my prescription. Is this true? I had a patient do that and got a very nice letter back from the Board of Registration in Medicine saying, no, that's silly. Then you could take your little letter to the doctor, or at least a conversation. The boards are pretty good about sending out letters, so you can call them first and then maybe send a letter. So this is called activism, and everybody needs to become active with the pharmacy problems, with the DEA problems, with the board registration problems. But thank you. That's a very interesting story. And my take on it is, as long as you got two doctors prescribing medicine that you can fill on different dates, you're fine. The law in this state is if two doctors prescribe opiates and neither one of them realizes the other one was prescribing, then that becomes a crime in North Carolina. So those are the stipulations. Two doctors at the same time not knowing the other one was prescribing. So I think you might want to go back to your pharmacist and say, look, I've been coming here a long time. How about I give the board a call? Would you mind if I did that to see if we can keep me on my medicines? Because when I don't take my medicines, my painful disease flares, just like if I had cardiac disease and I stopped my cardiac medicines, my cardiac disease would flare. So thank you for calling. That's very interesting.
All right. Well, we got 3 callers left, and this is an anonymous caller. Caller, what's your first name and what's your question for Dr. Kline and Josh?
And we're running a little bit late, so kind of stick to the key points.
Okay. My name is Cindy, and my question has to do with the combination of a benzodiazepine, opiates, and soma. I was taking those at fairly low doses, and I was told a few months ago that I cannot take soma anymore. That this
because
is
you're
called
taking the opiate with it.
Yeah, and it's called the Holy Trinity, apparently. So my doctor told me that the CDC claims that this particular combination of medications will lead to addiction. So you can take 2 out of the 3, but you cannot take all 3 of them. And I was wondering, is there data to support this?
Does it matter?
Josh, do you want to take this? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Does it matter? It's none of their damn business, is the data I need.
Okay. Yeah, the CDC... yeah, go ahead.
Tell anybody or any physician what drugs to prescribe. Like, shut up and let the doctors do their work. That's the data.
Yeah, it's kind of like, we were talking about the scope of practice. Is it within the scope of practice of CDC to be making recommendations about medications? But, caller, a lot of this is hysteria. The real facts are the FDA has a warning that if you're going to take these medicines together, since they all cause sedation, as does antihistamines, that should be on the list too, that you need to be careful. And just because there's a warning doesn't mean you stop taking them. You just be careful. So you might want to take your benzo and then take your soma and build up the dose and make sure you aren't drowsy. Overdose deaths do not occur in the general population except very, very rarely. People who die of combination benzodiazepine and opiates are street addicts because they take whatever they want. And I've talked to some street addicts, and they take huge doses of benzodiazepines because they all are anxious. They're actually taking it for the right reason. They're taking it because their anxiety levels are horrible. They don't want to be doing this. Their families are shot to pieces. The police are after them. So the CDC is using data from street addiction and trying to apply it to the general population. That's called dishonesty, and it's called terrorism. Not something our government should be doing. And as Josh said, this is none of their business. This is between, if you were my doctor, you were my patient, this would be between you and I. Now, the FDA issues warnings all the time. Did you know there's a warning on Tylenol, a black box warning, for a very severe skin reaction called Stevens-Johnson? But does that mean I'm not giving out any more Tylenol? The ignorance is just palpable. It's just awful. So from my standpoint, you need to ask more questions, and whoever is coming up with this Trinity stuff, track it down like a reporter. Where's this coming from? Oh, it's coming from the CDC. Okay, where in the CDC? I'll go find out. Get on the internet and put down Holy Trinity. Boy, that's a nice that's a nice new word, Holy Trinity. Wow. There are other Holy Trinities too, but we won't get into that. So try to track it down, and then you can go back to your doctor and say, Doctor, I can't really find any of this, and so I don't think you're going to be in trouble doing this. Oh, I might get into trouble. Then what do? You take your data you got, you go over to the Board of Registration in Medicine, and you say, my doctor thinks he's going to get arrested if he gives me these 3 drugs. Here's what I found. Is my doctor going to be charged by you, the medical board, if he does this? No, is the answer. Because believe it or not, medical boards do not have standards for prescription drugs. They only have standards for how to behave as a good doctor. Now, if I gave you huge doses and you were comatose all the time, like Josh was here earlier, then they might say, hey, you're practicing bad medicine. So people have the wrong concept about what the boards do. Boards don't set individual recommendations, and nor does anybody else in the government. They're actually pretty careful about that. So you got to track these things down. So that was a very good point, caller, and thanks for letting us know.
Tom, that also violates pharmacology. I use this as a saying whenever I'm interviewed. There is no drug or chemical on earth that is unsafe at a low enough dose, and there is also none that is safe at a high enough dose. So you can add Valium, 17 other benzodiazepines, heroin, fentanyl, and a popsicle together, and as long as the dose is low enough, it will not be harmful. And of course, these simplistic laws don't even take this into an account.
And then don't take into account the enormous variation, especially with opiates. But it's true of most all drugs. But opiates have the most enormous range of effectiveness. So, trying to set a 90 milligram thing is pretty sophomoric. So, one more caller, engineer.
I think that we've got, they keep coming in, what can I say? But I think we've got two that were here before before our 9 o'clock hour that we can get to. So
okay.
We'll jump to the next one now. Caller from area code 559. What's your first name and what's your question for Dr. Kline and Josh?
Hi, Dr. Kline and Josh. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
So I have been I have a problem, and then I have a success story where I have actually was able to get back to my regular dose. But first, I wanted to ask my question, and then if I have time, we can do that, or I can call back another time. But I've been a chronic pain patient for over 10 years in California.
What kind of illness do you have?
I have an L5S1 nerve impingement from where I was covering it up before I got into pain management and working, and I kind of hurt myself because I stretched out a really good job. I didn't want to quit. So I have some.
Okay, so, the reason I interrupted you is I think it's real important that everybody stops saying they're chronic pain patients because people don't understand that. They think they're fakers. So always start off with your disease. And I call this vertebral structural disease. I have vertebral structural disease, period. Okay, so then go on.
Okay, so I started in California. That's where I've lived. We recently moved here to Washington. But in California, I've had the same doctor for 10 years, and I've been on the same dose for 10 years, 100 milligrams of morphine 3 times a day, and some breakthrough, which I hardly ever used. Great function. I went to school. I was a basketball coordinator, coach, program director, all that. So I had a great, I was able to return to a lot of the things that I wanted to, even went to college for a couple of years. So it was working great. Didn't need to escalate or anything. The dose worked for the whole entire time. The one problem I did have was I found out while in school that I was having some cognitive issues, and I found out that my testosterone was really low as a result of probably the pain medication. So I made the conscious decision to want to lower myself if possible. So I got with my doctor, and I said, "Doctor, I want to try to lower my opioids down, and I want to supplement with cannabis." And he said, "Great idea," and he was all for it. So we started this taper, and I started using the cannabis with it. Didn't have any withdrawal side effects from going from 100 to 60. I think the cannabis helped me, or maybe you don't have them with that kind of taper. I didn't have any at all. And then my wife got a promotion, and we moved here to the state of Washington. In Washington, I got with my doctor. Well, after there was a doctor in my city, they make you jump through a million hoops. You'll go through withdrawals trying to go through all their policies, even though you're an established patient. So I won't talk about that. But I drive 150 miles round trip to see my current doctor, and I mentioned that I'm trying to go low. I wanted to try to go off if the cannabis was strong enough to do that. So I said I want to continue my taper, and I want to go down to 30 milligrams next and go, but I'm using cannabis. And he said, he turned his chair towards me, got real firm, and said, "I cannot allow you to do cannabis if you're taking opioids." So I don't understand why I don't have the option of treatment, especially when the option is better for me. So that would be my first question: is can a doctor do that when I have a better choice, healthier way of treatment that'll actually lower my dose, which is what the entire state is pushing for? How can he tell me not that I can't do that? Why is
his prerogative? Yeah, unfortunately, it's his prerogative.
Okay.
You know, I mean, he's making a professional judgment. He's the expert, and so you're stuck.
Okay. So after that, I said, well, okay, then I need to return to my dose. I tried to stop the cannabis at the 60s, and I started experiencing a little more pain. And then he took me down to 30. He goes, I got to taper you anyway because the government wants me to do it.
Not true. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I called CDC. I started getting on the phone. I wanted to find the source of this problem. I've been on the same medication very effectively for over 10 years. I wanted to find the source of the problem. So I called CDC, and they said, no, it's just a guideline. It's nothing mandatory. Your doctor should use his best judgment. So I presented that, and what I finally did was I started complaining to the hospital quality assurance and the manager. Mm-hmm. I'd explain that I've had a great outcome on this. Why is someone doing this to me? Because once I got down to 30, the first thing to come back was my foot pain and my big toe. It felt like I got hit with a sledgehammer in my foot. I couldn't sleep. All of a sudden, I developed high blood pressure. My eye was twitching constantly. I've never had any of these problems. And I couldn't sleep, and it was just really affecting me. I could barely read books. I read and study all day. I couldn't do that anymore. So finally, I ended up taking my wife with me. I think it's a good idea to dress up a little bit. You need to try to deal with the stigma that these doctors have. So I wear a nice shirt, even a tie sometimes. I took my wife with me, and we went in there, and I asked for the manager to be in there, and it worked. The doctor did mention something about palliative care, but he returned me to my dosage. But the manager that a couple of days before said, I think you're going to be happy when you come in because the doctor mentioned that he's going to transfer you to, I forget the terminology, somebody here in Washington State that evaluates you, I think, for palliative care or something. But he didn't do that. So I don't know if he's just returning me to the dose based on my record or if he is going to send me later.
No, you don't need the palliative care, although you'd qualify. It's real simple. You have a disease you can't treat, and it develops symptoms that, if relieved, would make your life better. Has nothing to do with your lifespan. That's it. You can make the diagnosis in any doctor's office like you make the diagnosis of an earache. You don't have to go anywhere. It's a simple thing. And if doctors want to learn this, they go on to Google and Google the word medium, and then Google the word palliative care, and then Kline, K-L-I-N-E, and that will take you to my website where there's some nice little papers that you can download and a form, palliative care form, you can download and send them to your doctor in the mail. Don't come into the office and stick them on his desk. And the physician will realize that this is a simple thing. You can be qualified, and that will protect you from any future reductions. But you're doing the right thing. This is what people have to do. It's too bad they have to defend their own health, and you did a beautiful job. And the CDC has been saying this for a long time, but they don't say it loud enough. You know, every once in a while, one of them will come out and say, we didn't really mean for everybody to be tapered, but too bad. Look what's happening. I mean, people are running around like they've got this 90 milligrams branded on their forehead. People love numbers. They did a study and said that people love even numbers, like 90, 100. If you said the cutoff was 92, they wouldn't be interested. So, yeah, good luck. And you're in a state where there's an awful lot of opioid phobics, but stick to your guns. Now, the other thing I want to say is what I kind of did. When you're in a doctor's office, you don't say, my pain is excruciating. What you say is, doctor, since you reduced me, I can no longer drive my car. It is so painful for me to bounce around in my car, I have to stay home. I can't even take the bus. So you make it functional. What's happened to you? Just like you, doctor, now my pain has shot down my toe and I can't walk around the house. I have to sit in a chair all day. Is there anything else we can do about this? I mean, the pain medicine was working fine. The other myth, very important to bring up with doctors, is there's never, ever been a case reported of addiction for people who are already taking opiates. Once you're taking the opiates, you're safe forever. And this is a very common thing that doctors are worried about. They don't want to addict you. I mean, it'd be awful if you addicted somebody, but it's not going to happen. And that's another relevant piece of information people know. Josh, do you want to add anything to my ranting and raving? Okay.
No, I think that's sufficient for a few centuries.
Okay, one more caller.
We'll take our last caller for the evening. Another anonymous caller. What's your first name and what's your question for Dr. Kline and Josh?
Or you can have a phony first name if you wish.
Sure.
Hi.
Like my name is completely phony.
Hi. This
Hi.
is Julie in New York City. I just want to say one thing. Please, just to remind all your listeners, the HHS draft pain task force footnote docket is due April 1st. Please, everyone, tell their stories. It doesn't matter what they wrote. Just tell your stories. Tell them what the CDC has done to you. Tell them from just whatever you want. But there's only been, I think, 1,100 so far, and they're going to think that nobody is sick. We really all have to get together if this is the most important thing to do.
Okay, how can they get there? What's the quickest way to Google it?
Just go on Dr. Vanilla Singh's Twitter page, but HHS Pain Task Force docket, she's posted almost every day. Dr. Vanilla Singh, she is in charge of the Pain Task Force, and so it's basically, oh gosh, I should have had it written, but it's on my Twitter page too. I'm tweeting it all the time.
Okay, why don't you tweet it, and people can Google the HHS Task Force. That should get you there. Pain Task Force comments. And you are absolutely right. We need to get, if there's really 5 to 6 million people out there in this horrible, horrible pain refugee, get on the horn. I mean, this is what they need. They need large numbers. You tell your little story. Don't go on and on and on. Just make it brief. This is what I cannot do. This was done without my permission. This was done even though the medicine was working fine. Just the simple basics. And Dr. Singh is very interested in hearing from people. She's an ally. She's a real doctor, and she's practiced medicine a lot all around the world, and she's been an advocate for pain patients and other patients too, but right now an advocate for pain patients. So good that you brought that up. So Google HHS, Opioid Task Force, and see if you can get to their comments page. Very easy to use. You just put in your name and address, and you type in your comment, and they send you a copy of it. It's a very user-friendly kind of thing. So anyway, we will end the show, and I appreciate our guest, Dr. Josh Bloom, for coming along to give his highly important scientific input. Is that correct, Josh? That's what you told me to say, right?
I also appreciate myself very much as well. Thank you.
And we will see you next week at the Doctor's Corner with maybe some, hopefully, new news. We wait every day for new news, and one of these days, it's going to happen.
Absolutely. So, Thank you very much, Dr. Josh Bloom and Dr. Kline, for joining us this evening on the Doctor's Corner. Cost 360 Network wants to send condolences out to all those who've lost a loved one due to the undertreatment of pain with the chronic pain community. And rest in peace to Carla Denise Howard and Carrie A. Lucas. And a big thank you to our audience for taking some time out of your evening to join us here at the Doctor's Corner. I'm Brian Grimes with Dr. Kline, signing off until next Tuesday. Have a good evening, Caw Nation. This has been The Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgaway. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved.